Hello, and welcome to Apollo Sky's podfics. I'm Apollo, and this is Changling Families by LittleLadyBaker. Summary. What if everything was just a little different? What if Strickler had been there the whole time? What if Jim's dad left when he was a baby? What if Walt married Barbara? What if changelings were much closer? What if Jim wasn't the troll hunter? What if a changeling was the troll hunter? Chapter 1. Walt was astonished when Barbara told him she knew he was a changeling. James told me, she admitted, when he told me he's one as well. It's okay if you don't want to show me, Walt. I just thought you should know that I know. They were sitting in the flat that he shared with James, Barbara's fiancé. When did James tell you? Walt asked when he finally found his voice. Just before he asked me to marry him, Barbara blushed. He said he wanted me to marry the real him. Are you okay with this, Walt? The changeling hesitated for a moment. Of course, Barbara. What reason would I have to be upset? Barbara gave him a look. Walt, don't lie to me, please. If you're upset by this, just tell me. He sighed and hung his head. Changelings did not usually form bonds such as this. If the Janus Order found out, it would make Barbara and James a target. But Walt could tell. He was developing feelings for the redhead med student himself. I'm more shocked than upset, Barbara, Walt explained. I'm not used to growing close to others. Did James show you his changeling form? Yes, Barbara admitted. But you don't have to if you don't want to. I won't ask you to expose yourself like that. Walt wanted to wrap his arms around Barbara and never let go. He couldn't remember the last time someone was willing to even look at him once they found out he was a changeling. With a sigh, he stood and took a step back from the sofa. In a flash of green light, Walt had vanished, and in his place stood his changeling form, Strickler. Barbara gasped and covered her mouth. Her eyes darted over his light green skin and glowing yellow eyes. You, she stammered, you look like an avocado. Strickler fixed her with a bewildered stare. Well, that's not one I've heard before, he said. An avocado? James and my siblings usually claim that I look like a sour apple. Barbara giggled. That's what James said when I asked, but I don't like sour apples. I like avocados. Taking a step forward, Barbara hugged him tightly. You're my best friend, Walt, and I don't care what you look like. I love you. It was with those last two sentences that Strickler knew he would do anything for Barbara. Anything. Walt sat in the second row of the church when Barbara and James got married. While he, personally, wasn't too fond of the young changeling, he could easily see how happy James made his best friend, and Barbara's happiness is what mattered most to Walt. At the reception, after she danced with her new husband and with her brother, Walt asked Barbara for a dance. You look lovely, my dear, he whispered as he twirled her around the dance floor. Congratulations. Walt, she giggled, you're acting like this is the end of something. James and I aren't even moving that far away, just down the road and around the corner. I know that, Barbara, Walt chuckled, but that doesn't mean I won't miss you. I think I might even miss James being around the flat. Barbara laughed. Don't be so dramatic, Bartholomew Strickler. Think of it this way. James is my problem now. Walt laughed. Soon, too soon for him, but not soon enough for James, their dance came to an end. May you live your best life and always be happy, Barbara Lake, Walt whispered before kissing her on the cheek. Barbara blushed. Thank you, Walt. Without you, I might never have met James, and I don't know what I would do without both of my changelings. Walt smiled and handed her back to her new husband before sitting down. He watched as the duo happily danced around the floor to the upbeat music. You know, I was surprised when she told me she was marrying James. Walt jumped, startled at the sudden arrival of Lucas Lucky Sturgis, Barbara's older brother. I thought for sure she was going to marry you. She always talked about you more than she did about him. Walt narrowed his eyes. If you're trying to start trouble, it won't work. Barbara has never seen me that way, and she's my best friend, nothing more. Lucas fixed him with a hard stare before looking out at his sister. Keep telling yourself that, Walter. Keep telling yourself that. Chapter 2. Jim. Barbara and Walt sat across from each other at the little cafe near Barbara and James's house. What did you want to talk about, Barbara? Walt asked, taking a sip of his coffee. Barbara took a deep breath. I'm pregnant. Walt choked on his coffee. Walt! Barbara gasped. Are you all right? With a final cough, Walt looked up at her. I'm fine, he assured her. I just wasn't expecting that. When did you find out? Day before yesterday, Barbara said. Other than James, you're the first person I've told. Walt grinned. Well, congratulations, my dear. Do you know the due date yet? September or October is all I know right now, Barbara said. I'm going to the doctor next week. That's when I'll get an actual date. Then I'm going to finish the semester before taking some time off to focus on the baby. Walt nodded. If that's what you want to do, I'll agree that it seems like a good idea. But just so you know, I will babysit any time you need it. Before Barbara could thank her best friend, Walt continued, Oh, and I will be spoiling this child absolutely rotten. Barbara burst out laughing. I don't doubt that for a second, Walt. I really don't. Barbara was 3 months along when James started taking more shifts at work. Money's gonna be tight for a while, hun, he explained, especially after the baby is born. Because of this, James was rarely home. It was Walt who ended up helping Barbara with a lot, if not most, of the baby preparations. When she was 6 months along, Barbara and Walter began working on the nursery. They painted the walls a pale gray and put sky blue carpets in the room. Barbara wanted to wait until the baby was born to find out the gender. One day, Walt surprised her by spending 3 hours putting together the cot for her. She had walked into the nursery in the morning and found him sitting on the floor surrounded by parts. Damn IKEA, he muttered. Barbara chuckled. Well, good morning. Was James home when you got here? He was just walking out the door, Walt confirmed, not looking up. Insert tab A into slot C. There is no slot C! Barbara couldn't hold back her laughter anymore. But through it all, Walt was hiding something. He didn't tell anyone that he was reading every book on childbirth that he could get his hands on. If Barbara went into labor early, he wanted to be able to help her in any situation. It was during Barbara's 7th month that Walt received a package in the mail, written in his sister's handwriting. Walt ran several spells over the package, checking for curses before opening the accompanying letter. Dearest Strickler, it began. Walt knew his sister was being a sarcastic little shit, and he wouldn't have it any other way. It has come to our attention that your human friend is expecting a whelp. As it is unlikely either of us will be invited to the baby shower, we would like to ask you to give her our gifts. We promise they are not cursed. But you probably already checked for that, didn't you? We know how protective you are of the flesh bag. Your loving siblings, Nomura and Otto. Walter raised his eyebrows. Though the trio secretly loved each other, Walt was still astonished that his brother and sister had gone out of their ways to congratulate his friends. Packing up the gift, Walt made his way over to the Lake household. Barbara, he called as he entered. Living room, came her reply. Stepping into the spacious room, Walt saw Barbara sitting on the sofa reading a book. Hey, Walt, she greeted. What brings you over? My brother and sister sent you something, as well as their congratulations, Walt explained. Otto sent his all the way from Germany. Barbara put her book aside and turned to her best friend. They didn't have to. They wanted to, apparently. Walt lifted an eyebrow and shrugged. Now, open it. I'm quite curious about what the two of them think makes good baby gifts. Barbara smirked at him, but complied. She gasped when she saw what the two changelings had sent her. Nomura sent her a onesie with the words historian in training, hand-stitched, most likely by Nomura herself, across the front. Walt buried his face in his hands. Nomura, he moaned. She's a museum curator in England and will, most likely, try to fulfill those words. Barbara laughed and folded the onesie back up before holding up Otto's gift for the baby, a baby romper modeled after the X-Men character Nightcrawler, complete with tiny white baby mittens. Barbara grinned. This is adorable, and kinda ironic now that I think about it. James's troll form is blue, so the baby will probably be blue too, right? Walt shrugged. I'm afraid I can't answer that one, Barbara. I've never encountered a half-changeling child before. Your baby might even be human, like you. Barbara smiled and hugged her best friend, just in time for the baby to kick. Walt's eyes grew wide, and he looked down at the red head in his arms. Barbara laughed. You should see your face, she squealed. You act like this is the first time you felt him kick. It just doesn't stop being surprising to me, Walt admitted. Barbara placed his hands over where the baby was kicking. Walt let himself into the lake house on a lovely Saturday at the end of September. Barbara, living room. Walt followed the voice to the room and found Barbara sitting on the sofa with her feet on the coffee table. He chuckled and sat on the coffee table to rub her feet. How are you two doing today? He asked. Tired, Barbara said, leaning back. This little one kept me up all night. Walt chuckled. Did you keep Mummy up? You need to let her sleep now so she won't mind as much when you keep her up all night after you're born. Barbara kicked at him half-heartedly. Walt leaned forward and kissed Barbara's rounded belly. She groaned and leaned back once more. Walt stood up and massaged her shoulders. Would you like me to make you something to eat? Can you make me mac and cheese with little green trees in it? Walt nodded and gave her shoulders one last squeeze before heading into the kitchen. He was just draining the noodles when, Walt? The changeling rushed to her side. What's wrong, Barbara? Barbara had tears rolling down her cheeks as she replied, I think I'm having contractions. Walt sat next to her on the sofa, heart pounding. Okay, how far apart are they? 6 minutes? Barbara looked terrified. Walt forced himself to remain calm. He knew that panicking was one of the worst things he could do for Barbara at this moment. All right, what do you want to do? He asked, rubbing her back gently. Do you want to stay here until the contractions are closer together, maybe eat? Do you want to go to the hospital now? Barbara took several shaky breaths. I want to stay here a little longer. It might be just nothing after all. It's a little early, right? Sometimes babies are early, dear. You know that. Walt kissed her temple. Do you want to call James while I finish your lunch? No. Barbara was calming down. I'll call him before we head to the hospital. Walt nodded once more and went to finish making the food. They both ate quietly, and then Barbara asked Walt to put Just Like Heaven in the VCR. Walt was careful to keep track of how far apart Barbara's contractions were while they watched. It was nearly 2 hours from the first contraction that Barbara sat straight up in her spot. My water just broke. Walt sat up, fear gripping his heart once more. All right, do you want to go change your clothes before you head to the hospital, or would you rather just go? Can you get my bag from under my bed while I call James? I can. Walt retrieved the bag, as well as Barbara's fuzzy Crocs. Barbara was just setting down the phone when he returned. He didn't answer, she hissed through clenched teeth. Now Walt was angry. He had a stinking suspicion about where James Lake was and why he wasn't answering, but with Barbara so close to her due date, James should have picked up. Remember, Barbara, deep breaths, he said, instead helping her put on her shoes. Let's get you in the car. I'll call James when we get to the hospital, all right? Barbara nodded and let him help her to her feet and get out to the car. But they didn't make it halfway to the hospital before they saw red and blue flashing lights. Walt pulled over. A dark-skinned cop approached the window. Hello, you two. I'm Officer Scott. Do you know why I pulled you over? Walt pulled out his license and registration for his car, wanting to make this as fast as possible. I was probably speeding. We have to get to the hospital. Officer Scott looked over at Barbara and then back at Walt. I'll let you off with a warning this time. And how about I give you a police escort to the hospital to keep you from getting pulled over again? Thank you, Officer Scott. With Officer Scott's help, Walt and Barbara made it to the hospital in record time. 2 nurses took Barbara back while Walt stopped by a payphone to call James and thank Officer Scott again. Don't worry about it. My wife is due in a few months too, so I'll probably do the exact same thing you did. Oh, Barbara's not. Officer Scott had already walked away. Crap. Walt paced back and forth in the waiting room. It had been 4 hours since Barbara went into labor. Walt had been there with her for the first 3. That was when James had arrived, and the nurse had told Walt that he would have to wait outside. He sat heavily in one of the chairs, and his leg began to bounce uncontrollably. They kick you out? Asked the young nurse. Walt looked up at her. Only one person is allowed in the delivery room, and I thought it should be her husband. The nurse nodded and sat beside him. But you're still worrying. It wasn't a question. Walt hung his head. I don't think you'll be waiting much longer, the nurse assured him. Walt knew she was just saying it to make him feel better, to comfort him. Walt Strickler, the nurse from the delivery room, called. You can come in now. Walt leapt to his feet and followed her back into the delivery room, forgetting all about the other nurse. In fact, the new nurse continued, Miss Lake asked for you to be let back in, even after the doctor recommended she get some rest. Walt refused to admit how happy that news made him, but in the delivery room, James occupied the chair by the bed. But it was Barbara who held Walt's attention. Walt! She instantly perked, despite how exhausted she clearly was. Come here, there's someone I want you to meet. Walt obeyed and sat on the edge of her bed, eyes glued to the tiny bundle in her arms. Walt, this is James Lake, Jr., Barbara introduced. Jim for short. And then, without another word, she set the baby in Walt's arms. Having not interacted with the baby in nearly 100 years, the changeling allowed his instincts to take over. He held Jim close to his chest, careful to support his head and neck. Jim reached forward and grabbed one of Walt's long fingers with his own tiny hand, and tiny he was, having been born almost a week premature. As Walt gazed down at the newborn in his arms, he felt his heart warm. And, out of all the words in all the languages he knew, only one word came to his mind. Atlas. He breathed. Barbara burst out laughing. Of all the things to say when handed a baby, and you say Atlas! Walt blushed. I don't know why I said it. It was the one thing that came to mind. James was giving Walt a sour look. His name is Jim. "I know that, James," Walt said, tearing his eyes away from the precious bundle in his arms. "I truly don't know why I said it." James chose that moment to coo, drawing Walt's attention back to him. As the green changeling looked down at the baby, he realized exactly why he had said Atlas. It was in that moment that Bartholomew Strickler made a choice that he hoped was the right one. He gently handed the newborn back to his mother. "He's beautiful, Barbara," he whispered, carefully prying Jim's hand from his finger. "Almost as beautiful as his mother. I have a meeting that I have to get to, but I'll come and visit the very first chance I get. I promise." Barbara looked a bit put out, but nodded. "All right, Walt, visit soon." "I will, Barbara," Walt agreed and departed. He drove to the Arcadia Canal and walked under the bridge. "What are you doing here, impure?" A large blue troll in shining silver armor growled from the entrance to Troll Market. Walt looked up at Changlings. "I wish to speak with you and Vendel about a proposition." And that is the end of today's chapter. Well, 2 chapters, actually. Goodbye.